I mean, over 20% of women in the UK are on antidepressants. And just under half of all women, again in the UK, are on some kind of psychotropic medication, whether that's antidepressants or antipsychotics or anti-anxiety medications or mood stabilizers or, you know, what have you. They're the most medicated people on earth. And they're plagued by body image issues in the societies that supposedly liberated them from objectification. 13% of women have contemplated suicide because of how they look or how they feel about how they look. And 10% of them have actually self-harmed because of the negative feelings they have about how their bodies look. 15% of women in the UK have eating disorders because of feeling that they don't fit to the societal beauty standards, which is just another way of saying that they feel that they're coming up short when being objectified. Well, that's not rejection of objectification, that's capitulation to it. And speaking of objectification, the countries of the West, Europe, the UK, the United States, and so on, these are the top producers and consumers of pornography in the world. The number of women in the UK who have reportedly entered into prostitution has doubled over the past year or so, since the cost of living crisis has hit Europe because of the Ukraine war and the sanctions against Russia. Put that in perspective. The median income of the poorest people in the UK is roughly 15,000 sterling pounds per year. The median income in Malaysia is 2,000 pounds less than that. But supposedly, being so poor as to earn 2,000 pounds more than the average Malaysian is enough to drive women in the UK into prostitution. And Malaysia is not an impoverished nation. And this is the average, the median income for the whole country, not for the poorest segment of the country. But in your society, the economic system apparently requires women to rent their bodies out to men for sex in order to be free, independent, liberated women financially. No, you can't cope with modernity. You can't cope. And that's to say nothing of other areas, other areas in the society, like how so many of you drink and do drugs on a regular basis. I mean, you literally have to dull your minds, impair your judgment just to cope with life. You can't even have fun unless you get drunk. Think about that. How miserable do you have to be that you can't even enjoy your free time, your leisure time in your right mind? And look at the looting that's going on in broad daylight in the United States. Outlets are closing all across the country just because they're getting robbed blind on a regular basis by mobs of people. You have a homelessness epidemic, you have an opioid epidemic, Sweden is going to bring the army in to fight criminal gangs. Your societies are unstable. You are internally, deeply, socially, psychologically, mentally, and emotionally unequipped to deal with modernity, to deal with the modern world, with so-called liberalism. Your societies, your character is incompatible with the belief system that you claim. I mean, if the West created the modern world, nevertheless, they find themselves foreigners in it because liberty and freedom just become chaos and mayhem without moral grounding. Without moral grounding, it doesn't matter how nice your infrastructure is or how advanced your technology is. You'll still behave like a savage. You're a caveman at the opera. And without moral grounding, without moral maturity, liberty and freedom is just license. It turns your cities into a wilderness. It turns your life into a wilderness. But that's because most of these concepts, most of the so-called Enlightenment concepts, you ripped off from the Muslims. But you didn't take the religion, you didn't take the religion that provides the necessary framework for any of these concepts to actually work and make sense. It's like you ripped pages out of a book, but you didn't take the book. So the story is disorderly, it's unorganized, it's not coherent. It's all out of order. John Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Thomas Jefferson, all of them took inspiration from Islamic civilization. Because of course they did. Where else are you going to look for inspiration? It was the most sophisticated, the most advanced, the most well-managed, well-organized, the most moral, and the most ethical civilization in human history. Of course you're going to look to them. I mean, you couldn't even look to your beloved Greek philosophers if it hadn't been for us. You left them in the dustbin of history. And whatever you have read from them, and whatever you read from them now, it has first passed through Muslim understanding and interpretation before it ever reached you. What you call modernity is just a deformed, maladapted, inferior version of the civilization that we had centuries before the Enlightenment. The difference being that ours worked. Ours was coherent. Ours could be understood and practiced. But you see, you only took concepts that would allow you to remain the same, to not actually mature or develop or civilize, but which would allow you to pretend that you did. Because individual liberty sounds much more sophisticated than shameless. Personal freedom sounds better than amorality or irresponsibility or social irrelevance. The free market sounds much more noble than the feudal system. And as long as you use these elevated, pretty sounding words, you can stay just as oppressive and savage and brutal as you always were and call it modernity. And as long as you have some level of material prosperity, you can maintain the charade to some extent. But just let that prosperity deteriorate, just like it is doing now. And you'll see how little you've actually changed, how little you've actually matured or civilized over the past 2,000 years. Watch, the cost of living goes up, the quality of life goes down, and your women immediately prostitute themselves. And your men immediately start burning and looting, just like the old days. And just like the old days, your feudal lords and masters are going to turn the guns on you. And then you'll know what your so-called civilization really is, what your societies really believe in. And it isn't liberalism and it isn't modernity, I can tell you that. It isn't democracy and it isn't freedom. It's predation and subjugation and exploitation and brute force. It's do as you're told. It's a hierarchy of cruelty where everyone uses and abuses whoever is lower than them on the ladder, rich and poor, white and black, native and immigrant, men and women. And it's going to be a harsh awakening for everyone who thought that they lived in an advanced civilization or who thought that the Muslims were the ones who were incompatible with the modern world.